I'd like to welcome retired Captain David Greer back to the show here for I'm not sure how many times now, how many hours it's been, but wanted to actually start a brand new podcast called The Merchant Mariner in January of 2025. It'll be actually presented by Workboat. So this will be the first episode. That'll be the plan anyway. I'd like to welcome you back to cover the history of steamboats. Um, Anything else you'd like to discuss before we get started?
No, I'm ready. I'm ready to go.
Well, as I did mention, if you have a 2 hour presentation, I'm here for it. I will share it with the class one of these days. But
Okay. I don't know how long. I haven't timed it, and I don't have it written down. So it's mostly I've got notes and off the top of my head, whatever occurs to me as I go along.
well, what I'm intending to do with this, and I think I've told you about this before, is that whatever you and I record today, I will throw together and cast out to a cast of characters that are involved in one way or the other with steamboats, or
Okay.
have been in their careers and lives, and possibly reconvene with you and this party of panelists with
Sure.
any additional questions or insights that maybe you didn't cover. But
Yeah.
anyway,
Sure.
so let's begin where it all began. I can tell you, I've not finished it yet, but I acquired the audiobook of Life on the Mississippi by Mark Twain.
Uh-huh.
I've been listening to it every weekend, a little bit here and there, trying to sort of familiarize and maybe frame up this conversation. So late 1700s, I think, we start migrating west from Pennsylvania. We find the Ohio River. You want to start from there?
No, I've got another. I've got a little prelude first. And
Okay.
first of all, I do have a source book that some of your people might be interested in. It's uh, it's Steamboats and the Rise of the Cotton Kingdom by Robert. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing his name correctly. Goodmastad. He teaches in University of Colorado, I think. Did his graduate work at LSU, and I didn't know him, but he certainly studied with some of the people that I knew at LSU. So this and there are not very many books about the river that are worth reading, but his definitely is. It's history, and it's a well researched book. Anyway, I borrowed some of his insights. I'm not going to footnote them or anything, but he's got his understanding of it is pretty comprehensive. It's an interesting book if anybody wants to read it. But my own narrative, as it starts with a personal experience. This was, I think, I don't remember if it was 1978 or 1979. I had been a pilot by then, maybe 3 years. I'm not sure. Uh, but I was living in Jackson, Mississippi at the time, and one drizzly Sunday morning, my girlfriend at the time and I uh, took a ride down the Natchez Trace and wound up in Rodney, Mississippi. Now, my girlfriend was from upstate New York, and the South was something she did not understand. She didn't get the South at all. And she was not interested in moonlight and magnolias at all. She was interested in what it was really about. But, I considered myself a pretty good guide. So I took her to Rodney. Do you know what Rodney is? You know where Rodney is?
I
Are you
don't.
familiar?
I
Okay,
don't.
it's a very old river town. It's north of Natchez by several miles. Right close to there is where Grant crossed his army in 1863. There's an old ferry landing there, but Rodney was probably first settled by white people, not necessarily settled, but they passed there in the 1700s. La Salle and Tonti, the French, and they called it Petit Gulf. It was because the river came close to the bluffs that you see at Vicksburg and Natchez, right there at Rodney, and made a big eddy up underneath the bluffs. So Petit Gulf, and it was by the 1820s, it became a going concern in the state of Mississippi. I mean, it was chartered as a town. But early on, I've always heard that a bunch of planters or planters' sons around there, Andrew Jackson may be among them. He was married close to there. And I built a cabin and a race course for, a cabin for his bride at the time, Rachel Robards. But Rodney was a playground. They had built saloons, and racing, gambling establishments and race courses and all that. So a whole bunch of flatboatmen stopped at Rodney, and sometime in the late 1900s, the river finally moved away from Rodney, and it became what they call a ghost town. And it really wasn't a ghost town. There was a small community of mostly African American people who lived there, and probably made their living as in the pulpwood industry. There were several pulpwood trucks around there. I think there was one white lady who was postmistress and probably ran there was a little country store there. I can remember first time I was ever there, I was about 12 years old. My grandfather and I would fish in Rodney Cutoff Lake. But I brought my girlfriend there. And it was, there was nobody on the streets. The real touristy places were the three old churches in Rodney. There was a Presbyterian church, a Baptist church, and a Catholic church, which subsequently they packed up and moved to Grand Gulf. But anyway, we parked and walked down the street, and we passed one house, and there was this old lady sitting on a rocking chair on a porch. And my girlfriend stopped and visited with her. I walked a little further down to the old store, and on a bench under the awning at that old store was an old black gentleman who was sitting there, had a half pint of whiskey in a paper bag. And I started talking to him. His name, I'll never forget it, was Howard Cowell. And he was a really sweet old man. He was about 78, 79 years old. So he was as old as the century at that time. And I told him, I mentioned that I was a river pilot. And he told me that when he was 10 or 11 years old, he had been a cabin boy on the steamer America, which was owned by a certain Captain Cooley. Cabin boy. I don't know what he did. He said mostly he sat outside the pilot house and waited for him to blow the whistle to call him. He would bring him coffee or sandwiches or empty chamber pot or, carry messages, whatever the captain needed. And I believe he told me he made about $10 a month or $10 a trip, one or the other. And he was 10 or 11 years old when he did this. Now, his father was a roustabout on that boat. He said his father was a heck of a man. He said he had seen his father get underneath a bale of cotton and walk off with it. Now, a bale of cotton weighed but 400 or 500 pounds, So his papa was a pretty stout fellow. But it was so fascinating to me, The old lady my girlfriend was talking to told her, "Oh, don't pay attention to that old man. He drinks." But at that particular time, I worked with a cook from Natchez, an African American gentleman whose name was Theodore Johnson, and Theodore knew Mr. Cow, and he said, "Whatever Mr. Cow said, that's the truth. Believe him." So I did, you know. And I've always thought, what a remarkable. I mean, it was like a visitation for past, you know. There's nobody like that in the world today. I got to meet this guy and hear a little bit about what life was like if you were a young black boy on a steamboat not long after the turn of the century. And it brings up, I mean, Mr. Cowell did not live. I mean, when we think about steamboats, mostly, that we think we look at it with often a nostalgia for, a history that really never happened like that. The Moonlight Magnolia thing, like the Natchez Pilgrimage, with all these old houses and the girls dressed up in hoop skirts and all of that. But life wasn't really like that at all, and it was just fascinating to me. It gave me, I felt like, a real touchstone, on a past that I would never otherwise have been able to imagine. So that's my starting point story. But mentioning Mr. Cow there, it brings up issues that we usually don't really want to talk about, but in fact, there are states in the United States where legislatures have passed laws that you can't talk about this. You can't teach in school about certain matters that virtually define America. It's almost as if they want to create a state of amnesia. And I'm not going to do that, not here. And what we're talking about, of course, is race and chattel slavery. We're also, when you talk about steamboats, you have to bring up issues of indigenous removal and genocide. And, when you talk about steamboats and the river itself, you have to bring up issues of environmental degradation, because all of that's involved. And you also have to bring up something we seldom mention, which is caste. And caste is very important. It's these ideas that interest me a whole lot more than inventions. So I'm gonna linger with that a little bit off and on. But when you have a certain, what we want to hear when we talk about history is something heroic, and this is not the history of angels. This is the history of human beings. So heroism is not a steady state. It's something that we sometimes are capable of and sometimes not. But to start talking about steamboats, I do have to talk about an age, an era, an episode in our history that does seem kind of heroic. And that is the settlement, as you mentioned earlier, of the Trans-Mississippi West. And these are interesting people, who cross the Appalachian Mountains after the Indian Wars, sometimes before, but after we created our Constitution, after the Revolutionary War mostly. And they're like no other people that we've ever encountered. And I think to a great extent, we've lost the sense of them. It's a history that probably be pretty proud of, and yet we don't really remember it very well. Uh, these were people, if you think about it, mostly who there was no place for them in the East. Not really. Certainly not, among the mansions of South Carolina and Virginia and the tobacco. These were not Jefferson's yeoman farmers. These were more likely to have been the children or grandchildren of indentured servants. They were the refuse, the rejects from England. They were people, they didn't want them there, they sent them here, and they didn't really want them here. But they wound up being, because they were disposable, because they had no other opportunities, they wound up being the shock troops of the frontier. They fought the Indians. They crossed the mountain passes into the river valleys of the Ohio, the Monongahela, the Allegheny, and so forth. And there was nothing there. And when you look at them and you study their history, it's amazing the energy that they did this with. These may have been, after the Declaration, after the Constitution, these people were, this was their revolution. This was their opportunity. And they had never, people like that had never had an opportunity like that in their lives, in their history, not for generations. They may have been or have felt themselves to be the most free people there ever was, the people most at liberty. So that, they settled the West and they didn't look back. And I'm not sure that they wanted anything from the people back in the East. They no longer needed the aristocrats, the money people back in the East. They were perfectly capable of taking care of themselves, and all they needed was an axe, a long rifle, and a plow, And so that they came into these areas with so much vitality. These are the people who wound up, working on the keel boats. And, the Mike Finks, the alligator horses, you might call them. These were people who probably wound up doing the hardest labor that free people have ever done. And they didn't need anything from the East. There was nothing in the contract that that said that they had to belong to that country on the other side of the Appalachians. They were their own people. And that's a remarkable thing. And the story of the steamboat is how they came to belong to the United States to some extent, and what they did with that. The only thing they lacked was trade. And what they did was they grew their crops. They would take their corn and turn it into barrels of whiskey. They would take barrels of flour. They would do whatever it was they did, and they created the what one historian has called a vernacular adaptation, and that's the keel boat, the broadhorn, the flatboat. And it was perfectly adapted to the seasonal, shallow rivers of the western rivers, like the Allegheny and the Monongahela and the Ohio and the Tennessee and the Cumberland. It was rectangular in shape, flat bottom, had no hydrodynamics at all, and basically the idea, it was a raft, thousands of years old, but particularly adapted to these conditions. It was designed to hold a maximum load with a minimum draft. And it worked just fine. They would put a rudder on it, but basically you navigated it with something that looked like barn doors on stems, on sticks, these sweeps that were not for rowing or propulsion, but for canting this way or that in the current to move this vessel, to go this way or that way, or to slow it down, to let it float out about around obstacles, that sort of thing. It was, I think, about 15 feet wide, because that was the wide or the best channel in low water or reasonable stage of river at the falls of Louisville was about 17 feet wide. So you had to be wide enough, narrow enough to go through those rocks there. And it might have a little cabin built on top of it, and they would, in open river, a lot of them would band together. They would lash these flat boats together to create a larger raft that could be maneuvered the same way you would a smaller boat, and they'd come together for protection, just to get themselves down the river. And they would float these things all the way to New Orleans, presumably, sell their agricultural products, which would go out on ships to various places in the world, probably mostly to ports in New England. Then they'd walk, and they would dismantle these rafts, sell the timber, and walk back home. And that's what they did every year. That was they did it during this time early on. You had the New Orleans, the port they came to was owned by the French and the Spanish, the French, the Spanish, the French, and the Spanish again, by several people. None of them necessarily welcomed these Westerners, these Southwesterners. So they had that problem to deal with. But there were the only way. It's very expensive to do all that. That's in terms of labor. That's expensive, but not as expensive as it would have been to haul that stuff across the mountain passes. You couldn't have done it. And there were some commodities that they needed in trade. It might be rifles. It might be lead shot. It might be cloth to make a dress, or ribbons, or whatever it was, some necessities, to survive. Those would come sometimes over the mountain passes at a great deal of labor in wagons. And that just didn't work very well. It was too hard. That was too labor intensive. The next best thing was the keel boat. A keel boat or barge sometimes could be as long as 100 feet. And it was exactly what it said it would. It had a keel, a keelson, a central member. And so that you could actually drag it back up the river. And that's pretty much what they did. You sometimes in low, if you got the conditions right, the wind right, and the river was not in flood stage, you could sail it up the river for a little ways. But mostly they just had to drag the thing. They might get out on a bank, drag it up the river. They might pole it, They might run the yawl up to a sawyer or a snag, and tie a rope to it and pull themselves up to the snag. whatever they had to do. It was brutal. And that's where you get these Mike Finks, these tough guys, maybe some of the toughest people there ever were, and that's also where you got later on after Nicholas Roosevelt built steamboat. That's where you got your river pilots from. I remember reading about one river pilot on the Arkansas River who learned the river basically by wading it, dragging it, helping to drag a boat up it. It was that shallow. And that's how he learned the river. He knew it pretty well. Anyway, you have Nicholas Roosevelt in 1811 building the New Orleans, city of New Orleans, when it was the first steamboat.
Now, did the steam engine, is this when rail began to develop? Is this when the contention between rail and barge
No,
originated?
that's coming. That happens slowly. It develops slowly. It's very important because it changes things a lot. But you've got about 30 years there. Nicholas Roosevelt comes down the river in 1811, 1812 with the New Orleans. And for the next, I don't know, 5-10 years, they experiment with it. Everybody realizes the value. This is the first time in human history that there's been an invention that will move against the force of gravity without using human or animal muscle. This is revolutionary, and they realized it. And this is something George Washington helped develop a steamboat. He was a proponent of, he helped several people, trying to develop a steamboat. And finally, I don't know who it was, Fulton and his partner, I forget who he was, a big politician. He was one of the guys who helped negotiate the Louisiana Livingston. It was his name. He was the same Livingston that helped to negotiate the Louisiana Purchase. And he was a partner with Fulton. And they proposed to have a monopoly on all river boats everywhere. But the steamboats that they created for eastern rivers, like the Hudson, and for, going up and down the coastline, they were very different. They would not have worked. They did not work, on the Mississippi or the Ohio, which were just most of the time too shallow, and it took a while. Shreve is one of the people who developed it, and basically what he did is just put machinery on a raft. Put the steamboat, the steam engine, and the condenser or whatever on the raft, and maybe build a gingerbread superstructure around it. And that was your steamboat. Basically, it was a raft. And river boats today, towboats and barges and rafts of barges, they're the same darn thing. Same principle. If in navigation, in terms of navigation, you use the river to do the work. You position this vessel in the river so that the river's current does the work. You're not gonna paddle a steamboat or a towboat, for that matter, fast enough to outrun the currents at Vicksburg Bridge. It's not going to happen. You've got to position your tow so that it falls in there, it falls through there. You got to use the current, not be used by it. Anyway, that's basically the principle. And it took a while for them to develop that. It took until probably it really started to make a difference, probably you know, 18, 17, 18, 19, 20, 18, 20 or so. That's when and it was, everybody realized that. Everybody was building steamboats. They broke this monopoly pretty quickly, you know, because the steamboats was, first of all, it was cheap to build. Now you couldn't build them in the South. They didn't have the manufacturing capacities even then to build a steam. Certainly not then to build a steamboat. Most of them were built up on the Ohio River somewhere, you know, and brought south. There at Louisville, at Jeffersonville, was a early Howard shipyard, or what became Howard Shipyard, or that was one of the places they built. But it was cheap. You could be, that was the province of the small investor, and that was so appropriate for that time and that place. And this was cutting edge technology all over the world. And this is an interesting time. You had actually about 30 years when I think of it as like the hot spot, you know. You have like Yellowstone, you know, somewhere down underneath the continental plate, there's this vent where you've got all this hot stuff coming up, and the plate moves so that the caldera of this volcano, you know, stays in one place and the plate moves over it. So that's kind of what this was. It was, and this is revolutionary. It truly is. This is probably, it's something that happens very often in our history, but certainly happened for the first time during this period. And that's when you have this remarkable acceleration of change that it may only last one generation, where so much happens that you can't assimilate it all. And I'll make this parenthetical observation here. Americans, whether we like it or not, are very materialistic people. But has there ever been a more inventive people anywhere in human history than Americans? I don't think so. We make things, you know, and create things that change everything. And we like to think that we're in control of this, you know, like, but we own, what we make, but we don't. More often than not, it owns us, or comes to own us, and it changes us. It makes we're not the same people in 1850 as we were in 1820. We're a very different country. And that happens so quickly. That's in one generation. You know, somebody could be 10 years old in 1820, you know, and 30 years later, they're just 40, and and it's already changing. It's changed the world profoundly, you know, and it created, well, the first thing it did was it created a global economy, you know, based on chattel slavery between, I don't know, 1820 and 1860, somewhere in there. There was at least 1 million African American slaves who were brought into the South. At least 1 million of them. You know, there may have been more. I think around that 1860, you might have had 4 million slaves in the South. But this enormous migration that nobody talks about happened because of the steamboat. That's where the people suddenly, you know, turned all of this rich river valley land into cotton. Interesting point about Rodney. They call it the Petit Gulf strain of cotton. That's the cotton that made everybody rich. It was created, developed by a horticulturist in Rodney, who patented it, I guess, and sold it, and it went all over the Southwest anyway, because it was extremely resistant to the boll weevil, much more so than other cottons. Anyway, you have the Cotton Kingdom, the creation of the Cotton Kingdom. Now, this is capitalism. You can read, what Karl Marx is writing at his kitchen table in London, and see, what that looks like from the other end. That's the creation of William Blake's satanic mills, who create all these cotton clothes, these cotton fabrics, and sell them all over the world. That's Mississippi Valley cotton. And that makes these people in this region enormously wealthy. And it changes everything. To start with, the Southwest, was not really connected to the eastern half, particularly the eastern South. By that time, by the 1830s or so, people like John C. Calhoun had begun to develop these ideas about states' rights. You didn't hear those in Mississippi or Tennessee. You heard that the Mississippi River is a vehicle for commerce, and the government needs to make some improvements here, and they did. Shreve built this snag boat that did some profound changes to the river itself. He got all the snags out of the river, yeah, but he also got the snags out of the Red River, this raft that had plugged up the Red River. He got that out, and that changed the Red River, because it sent a lot of it down, to the Atchafalaya. He made this cutoff where the Red River went in at one end and the Atchafalaya went out at the other, and it made this cutoff. And that's why you have an old river control structure now, 100 and something, 200 years later, because of what he did. Nature takes its time, but it could very well, and probably will one day, capture the flow of the Mississippi down the Atchafalaya River. But other changes you had, they made things worse on the Mississippi to some extent by cutting the steamboats. Use an enormous amount of wood, huge amounts of wood, and they basically cut down the forests along the Mississippi in Ohio. And there was nothing for bank protection there. They didn't have any more snags and everything to kill steamboats with, maybe, but it changed the flow of the river. It caused cutoffs. It caused erosion. And you had pollution. I mean, it was the Ohio and the Mississippi. That was just a continental toilet, basically. That's where it from Pittsburgh south, have a drink of water in New Orleans, it did that. And then conditions on these boats. I mean, this is fascinating to me. It's kind of a dog eat dog, crabs in a bucket society among the people working on these boats. You had slaves that were contracted out to steamboats, and they were at the bottom of the pile there. But you also had, you know, white people. You had immigrants. You might have Irish immigrants. You know, they weren't. The slaves might have been worth something. An Irishman wasn't. You know, and they were. If somebody fell overboard, the boat didn't stop. You know, it was pretty brutal. Labor was brutal at that time. That's fascinating to me. Imagine what it's like to live on one of these things. But you know, it also there were other changes. You have the Indian removal during the 1830s. You know, the Trail of Tears. Well, most of that was carried out by steamboat. There's a fascinating episode in Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. That's an important book. I feel sorry for people just have to read it now, but because it's not the easiest read in the world, but it's really an important book. This French nobleman, and his friend Beaumont, both French noblemen, they work out some kind of plan where they come to the United States to study prisons. And they basically travel all around the country, or a lot of places in the country. And they even have an audience with Andrew Jackson, who's president at the time. But Tocqueville winds up writing this 2-volume book that's still important today, because he understood us a lot better than we understood ourselves. And he comes to Memphis in the winter of, I don't know whether it's 1835 or 1836, bitter winter in America. He gets sick on the way, and in this cabin where there's as much snow inside as outside, and he almost dies, but he makes it to Memphis. And he and Beaumont go out one morning hunting with the Chickasaw for Carolina parakeets. Chickasaw use their feathers, for decoration and stuff. Anyway, he does that, and the river is full of ice. Him and Beaumont, their time's kind of running short. But at some point they're supposed to catch a ship back to France, and they can't get out of Memphis because there are no steamboats running in the ice, And one day, finally, a northbound boat shows up, and this captain, he's planning on getting up the river, somewhere when the ice clears, and getting that first load out and making a bunch of money, right? That's his, and he washes the ice off the landing and lands. And Tocqueville and Beaumont ask him to take them south, and he says no. But finally, this government guy, who has with him a group of Choctaw that he wants to take, and he's got the money to pay for them, for their transportation to Arkansas Post, the Arkansas River. And he goes for it. And so, Tocqueville and Beaumont, they get their ride south. The ice, I think it rains, the ice rots, and, so they're going south with these Choctaw. And he describes loading these Choctaw on the boat. And it was just sad people. They were so poor. They had these rags for blankets. And he's really he's upset by this. by this old woman with the Choctaw who's practically naked, and she's just this miserable character. He's shocked by it. It's unseemly to him. He doesn't, you know that he doesn't know anything about Choctaw. This is the mother of these people, and the mother's body is not repulsive to the Choctaw, but they're loaded onto the boat. Their dogs, start howling and trying to jump into the river after them and all this. It's just a pathetic scene. But they take them south. And somewhere around the mouth of the White River, they pick up another passenger. The other passenger happens to be Sam Houston, who, he was governor of Tennessee. His wife left him for another man. He turned to drink, quit that, and then went to live with his adopted people, the Cherokee, in Oklahoma. But he was on his way to Washington to advocate for these Indians. And, Tocqueville and Beaumont met with him. I don't think they could have learned a lot from him, but I don't think they did. Tocqueville's idea was basically the same thing as Jefferson's and Jackson's and everybody else, that these people, I feel sorry for them, but they got to go. Anyway, steamboats did that. They are the ones that create, and that's where the lands came from to plant cotton with, from these Indians. Anyway, this lasts up until about 1850. And this is the golden age of steamboating. And it creates enormous wealth throughout the Mississippi Valley. What's our time going? How are we looking on time?
Shy of an hour still. We're good.
Okay. Well, I don't know if I've got 2 hours here, but this is when things start to change, about 1850, because the North, the South chooses an agrarian society. And why not? They're making all, as far as they can tell, this is going to last forever. You have people who are imagining a slave society over both continents, North and South and Central America, a global chattel slave economy. They're imagining this. And they're very powerful. They're people with a lot of money. There's it's worth more. This economy, I think the slaves themselves were, if you put a price on them, they were something like $3.5 or $4 billion worth of property, which was more than all the manufacturing in the North, more than what was than the railroads. It was the single most important financial fact of the United States, was the investment in human property. If you wanted to borrow money and you were a planter in Natchez, you didn't put up your land. Land was cheap. You put up your slaves as collateral. And what your slave was worth had more to do with the cotton exchange in London than it had to do at the slave auction. But it was, I mean, we think about this, and I mean, this is not old Black Joe, this is barbaric, and yet this is the system we have. And all of this, of course, created because of the steamboat. And they, as far as they knew, it was going to last forever. The trouble is, things were starting to change. People in the North were more in the tradition of New England mercantilism, you know, and they were buying cotton from the South to create in their, mills and using them just like everybody else were. But at the same time, there were other manufacturing ventures going on, and they were building a transportation network. They were building railroads. Now, there was one railroad, for instance, I think in St. Louis, that would take you to somewhere where you could catch a steamboat and go on to Kansas City. And then gradually they lengthened the railroad. Well, you didn't have to ride a steamboat, you know, and they started agricultural products and on the upper and on the Ohio, that trade started going to the railroads because there were railroads. There were bridges across the river by then. You had the Eads Bridge, later on, but you did have one in the 1850s that, a steamboat. It was one of the cases that Abraham Lincoln, won as a lawyer, as an attorney, when they tried to have this railroad bridge torn down, and they lost the case. But by this time you had a lot going on in the North, and this started to take away the business. It started taking away the backhaul business. It started to take away the commodity, the farm business, from steamboats in the South. And they started feeling this. Things were starting to change. And this was a whole different kind of economy that was being built. But the power in the United States at this time were these handful of very wealthy planters, these millionaires. There are more millionaires in Natchez than in New York City, at one point. And they had a lot of, they had the president. This was a Democratic Party at the time. They had the presidency. They had both houses of Congress, and they had the courts. And they managed. I think it was in 1854, wasn't it, where they created that they passed. Stephen Douglas is the one who got this through Congress. The Kansas-Nebraska bill. The Kansas-Nebraska bill kind of neutralized the Missouri Compromise. The Missouri Compromise, the plan was that for every slave state, there would be a free state, at the same time. Well, in the Kansas-Nebraska bill, they decided that the people who lived in these states, they could decide whether or not to be slave or free, which pretty much upset the balance. The real power, came into these slave states. And in the North, and even in the West to some extent, there was a lot of resistance to that. Abraham Lincoln probably was as concerned, maybe more so, about what slavery did to free labor. It was, slavery created that crabs in a bucket kind of economy. Free labor, as far as he was concerned, created community. It was more nearly what Jefferson meant by yeoman farmers. And so that was certainly an issue. If you're looking for reasons for the Civil War, that's probably it. Is that these powerful people in the South wanted a slave empire, and people in the North were not having any of it. and they elected Abraham Lincoln to be president. And these Southerners, got a burr up their butts and seceded. And we had a brutal civil war for 4 or 5 years, which supposedly decided the question. But whatever it did is it killed steamboating. That $3.5 or $4 billion property that the chattel slaves represented, that went away. That was gone. Would never come back, no matter that they eventually they created it virtually, and Jim Crow and all that. It went away. And that was to a great extent because the South chose an agrarian economy. But steamboats, they lost their cotton. You could grow cotton, but you weren't going to make any money from it because they found cheaper sources of cotton, in Egypt and Turkey and wherever, all over the world. They found other cotton. And what else did the South have? I don't think they even had peanuts at that time. They didn't have much, and they just got awfully poor. And they didn't build, and they still didn't build railroads. In 1930, there was one bridge, really, across the Mississippi south of St. Louis, and that was a railroad bridge at Memphis. One bridge. I mean, you think about, that here recently, that ship knocked that bridge in Baltimore, was it? Knocked it in the river. You think about how everybody freaked out about how that was going to impact the economy. Well, if you only have one bridge south of St. Louis, what kind of economy is that? It's not much. But they were still, by then they were stuck with steamboats. And it was still the province of the small investor, but it became more of a catch as catch can local trade. My old friend, Capt. Jesse Evans, Danny Evans' dad, he told me he's the one who, I think I've told you this story before. Capt. Jesse started working on log rafts when he was 8 years old in 1915, around Natchez, and he told me, that you could stand at the foot of Silver Street in Natchez under the hill and watch a steamboat leave at dusk dark, just before dusk dark, and it would take them all night to go around that long Marengo bend, which went, it was a long bend, but you would think they'd be able to go, but they wouldn't. It didn't go further because they had stops to pick up trade that probably didn't make much money on, So in the morning you'd see the smoke across the neck at Rifle Point. That's as far as they'd gone. And you had boats that people rowed, like Captain Cooley's America. I think Jefferson Davis rowed the America before he died. I don't, but they're just, it was the local trade. I knew an old man, Captain Ivan Bradford was his name. His family ran packets out of New Orleans up to Plaquemine, went through the lock at Plaquemine, and went back in those bayous back there behind Plaquemine, local stuff. And you've got basically such a wealth of rivers, but it's like you have two watersheds nesting in another. there in Arkansas, you have the St. Francis River, you have the Arkansas River, you have White River, you have all of that, and these big swampy areas that take you that you've got to cross several times by the time you get to Little Rock, and that's a long trip. If you had to, if you went to, if you lived, if you lived in Jonesboro or somewhere, and you were sending your child to the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville, he wasn't going to come home every weekend. That was a long, long trip. And the same way across Louisiana, you had Old Highway 80. It was the Dixie Highway, I think, at one time. And later on, it became one of the most dangerous highways in the country when they were building Interstate 20. But I had a friend who lived in Delhi who said after World War II, they cut down all that cypress swamp there. This is where Teddy Roosevelt, spared the teddy bear, and all these swamps where Teddy Roosevelt uh, hunted. But it was so rugged that he said they were going to clear all of that and clear the swamp and use it for cotton and beans and whatever agricultural land. And he said what they did was they got a huge saw and they mounted it on a jet on something that would hold and ran it with a jet engine, and said it would just mow down those cypress trees. Said for a year that whole country was just choked with smoke because it burned all that. It burned it all. He said you really didn't want to do that work. Said that particular saw said it'd get away from them sometimes and break off and run out through the woods. You wouldn't want to be in front of that. But then that was that was after the old Vicksburg Bridge was built. Old Vicksburg Bridge was built in 1930 or so, I think. And you started having bridges across the river by then. But it was just basically a small. I've got friends who lived along the Washita River who said that they got their mail and their groceries. There would be a little gas boat sometimes. But there was also my old friend, Captain Dutch Clark, I don't know whether I've told you this story or not. Dutch was raised on the Washita River, and there were no roads back in there. Huey Long built the first roads. You had gravel roads, dirt roads at best, so that everything they did on the rivers. They lived along the rivers. They fished in the rivers. They bathed in the rivers, all of that. And he said he went to, this must have been in the 1920s, and he went to school in a little one-room schoolhouse on the banks of the Washita River. And Dutch was a really smart guy, really intelligent man. And I guess his teachers knew that. And somehow or another, they had finagled a scholarship for him at LSU. And they told him that the last day of school. Dutch said he was sitting there and he looking down at his old bare feet in his overalls and said that he knew I wasn't going to any college. I wasn't going to any LSU. He said the timing was perfect. About that time, another Captain Cooley boat, smaller steamboat, the Betsy Ann at the time, came around the turn at Duty Ferry. So you could hear the bells. You could see it black stack when the pilot came ahead on it. And he looked at everybody was watching it, looking at it out the window. He said, "No, ma'am, there goes my university right there." And, he went to work on boats, of course. But that was You know, you're talking about compared to what it used to be, that's not very much. And in you don't have anything, nothing really changes until, you know, you have the 1927 flood and you had the Jadwin plan, but nothing really happens until the 30s when Franklin Roosevelt becomes president, and he's not just paying lip service to it. He sees that, you know, you could bring electricity to the South, you know, in the Tennessee Valley Authority. You can create jobs on the river. You can generate money you could create flood control. You can promote navigation and all this stuff. So he starts putting money into, they make the cutoffs, they change the river, but still nothing really happens, you know, in the South until after World War II. You know, that's, I think the last working steamboat may have been the Tennessee Belle. Old friend of mine, I can't think of his name, who worked for Waterways Journal, Keith Norrington, is that his name? He passed away recently. He said that it was the Tennessee Belle, and the Tennessee Belle burned up in 1942 on the foot of Natchez Island. And that was the last really working, you know, boat. You had other boats. I mean, we've got now even they're still trying to mine this vein of nostalgia. I don't think that's not as popular as it used to be. If you visit some of these river towns and take a look at them, they're kind of down at the heels. Natchez is, you know, a good billionaire could buy Natchez pretty, you know, without breaking the bank right now. But it's still mining that vein of nostalgia, you know, for a history that never happened. But it's interesting to me. I think to a great extent, you know, we still live with the effects of the steamboat. I mean, you look at these southern states. I'm thinking about Mississippi, my old home state in particular. I mean, you know, if they still have some of the attitudes of an agrarian state, you know, only they're not an agrarian state. You know, the only natural resources they have left are still that great farmland in the Mississippi Delta, but that's not an economy. I mean, I'm sure a lot of the people who always owned that area probably still own that, but you know, they work for 4 or 5 global, you know, international companies that tell them, you know, when to plant, what to plant, how to plant it, how much to plant, what they're going to get paid for it. You know, so it doesn't, you're not talking about, you know, any kind of vital economy. Otherwise, they're not a donor state. You know, they're probably the largest industry is medical care, hospitals and elder care and medicine, that kind of thing, except for government contracts here and there. And all of that comes to them because of donor states like New York, California, Massachusetts, and Connecticut, people where there are good jobs, union jobs, and they pay taxes that pay for Mississippi's Social Security and Medicare. You know, otherwise, it's, you know, they have the worst of everything, worst schools. They don't even provide, and they have this distrust of government. Same distrust of government as the old South. You know, the same kind of uh, I don't know what you call it, regard for their poorest people who are black. They don't even accept Medicaid for their poorest people. And a lot of these states are like that. You know, my own state is Arkansas, the one I live in now is to a great extent. We got something of economy up here in northwest Arkansas, but the rest of of Arkansas is not much different from Mississippi. And those are the attitudes of the old agrarian South. You know, they have no right. They have right to work laws, which means the right for employers not to pay you very much. Our governor recently even passed a bill kind of allowing child labor. you know, but anyway, those it's still it's still it still seems to me that we're shadowed by the world that the steamboat created. And we don't know that.
Well, thank you for all that, sir. I think that's definitely a good presentation to start with, like I was telling you before this began. But a few questions did come up. One that I had written down prior to sitting down with you.
Okay.
In Twain's book, Life on the Mississippi, and you mentioned it a couple of times. Were were there passengers on working vessels?
Oh yeah. Yeah, they always had passengers, I think.
And was it like a paying guest just riding downriver?
Probably, yeah, I think so. You had different classes. You know, if you were poor, I don't know what you had to pay, but you probably slept down there with bales of cotton, you know, and where you're close to the boilers. So if the boilers exploded, and that was an issue now. You know, we're used to machining parts down to 1/10, 10,000ths of an inch or so. You know, with some of those old steamboats, you're lucky if you could get down to a 1/4 inch. You know, that's why they blew up so much and exploded and burned, and that was terribly shocking to people. And it was really shocking to people because there were passengers on those boats. Indeed, there's a I don't recommend this, but one of the great books about America was written in 1857 by Herman Melville, called The Confidence Man. And it takes place on a southbound steamboat. And it's a miserable read. Like I say, I don't recommend it to anything, but it's one of those books that it's just fascinating to me because he really examines every aspect of the word confidence. That's from having confidence in yourself to being a con man. Because there's a lot of people trying to sell people something they don't want, for prices they can't pay, or for what more. It really describes the consumer economy that America becomes to a certain extent. I mean, if you're born after World War II, you spend a lot of time sitting in front of a television watching morons, or try to sell you uh, stuff that toothpaste or soap or automobiles or whatever. There's no difference between any of them. It's a version. I mean, the great essayist George Steiner called it a wash of mendacity. It does great harm to the language, to listen to that, because you're basically listening to people lie. And if they can lie and take your money, they have dominated you in some way. And you, or if they've taken your money, it's like nobody likes going to a car dealer and buying a new car, because you know that this Sharpie is planning to sell you stuff that you don't really want, that you're going to have to pay for a long time. You may come in there wanting to buy one thing and drive off in a $65,000 pickup truck that you never wanted, and you're going to have to pay for it for the next 6 or 7 years, right? And if they do that, they have got you, and that improves their confidence. They've made a sucker out of you. Anyway, that's that's just parenthetical, but it's a fascinating book, about some of the things, and it really was like that aboard these steamboats. You had all sorts of crooks and criminals and sharpies, card sharps, people. You come on that somebody would go to market and have a bag of gold and get, in a card game and lose it all. That happened so many times on steamboats. It was a bad crowd. There's a Fanny Trollope, who's the mother of the novelist Trollope, the English novelist, came to America, rode a steamboat, and up to Memphis. Bless her heart, she got to Memphis, and it was so muddy, she lost her good gloves trying to climb the hill at Memphis, on all fours like an animal, you know. And but she hated America. She hated steamboats. Such crude people spitting tobacco. You really these it's like watching, what was that great movie that based on McMurtry, Lonesome Dove. There are scenes in Lonesome Dove that will give you kind of a picture of people back in some of the people, some of the just plain trash that you ran into on steamboats. And even if you were wealthy, it was not terribly comfortable. Some of the big palaces they built after the Civil War, which are intended just for passenger service, they might have seemed elegant, but they still had the same bunch of reprobates riding them. Anyway, next question. I'm not hearing you. I can't hear you.
Because I hit mute instead of unmute.
Okay.
You'd mentioned it before, and I know I've read a little bit about it since we've met, but were packet boats kind of like the unit tows of today?
Uh, Packet boats were just, they were, it's accept anything. You could hail one, you could wave one down and he'd land and pick you up, or they would deliver commodities to you, or pick up stuff, just whatever business they could get. That was for packet boats. And sometimes you had some regular pack. You saw this a lot on the Ohio River, where you could kind of count on boats getting from Louisville to Cincinnati. You'd have packet service, and they'd have times when the boat would leave and times when it would arrive. And most of the time, or a lot of the times anyway, they made it. They hit on it. But later on in the early, I think the early part of the 20th century, when steamboats were kind of on their way out, packet service was kind of, I think, mostly catch and catch can. Captain Bradford's, their packet service, they were scheduled, where they had a route that they ran. And if you were on the route, you could deliver things to you or pick you up or pick things up or whatever. As much as I understand that, that's what packet boats were. Now, Life on the Mississippi is an interesting book, and it gives you you think about Mark Twain talks about these river pilots in those days were unfettered, the freest people that ever been, and he was right because the river was a dangerous place, and with these vessels or any kind of vessels on the river, the skill is not in operating machinery. The skill is in knowing the river, knowing where the sandbars are, being able to read it and tell what a sand. And they would have. I'm sure when I first started in the pilot house we had my first job. We went from Houston, Texas, to Freeport, Pennsylvania. In other words, from the intercoastal canal to 45-6 miles up the Allegheny River. And the Ohio River, you would have and they did not like us, these old pilots. They were still around, grouchy old men, and they resented people like me who just had a license. I could run anywhere. It didn't matter whether I knew where I was going or not, and most of the time I didn't. And these were guys who knew the river. At this time they were building these big locks and dams, which were knocking out the smaller locks and filling up these pools where you could run most of the time bank to bank anywhere. You just had to get out of the way of another boat. But these were guys who had known what the channel was like when it was real steamboat, when real boating, And it would it pissed them off just to hear our voices. You'd call them and say, "Yeah, go ahead." These old grouchy men. But what they did was their license may take them, from Gallipolis, to Huntington or to Louisville or something, and that would be they just run that route. When they got at the end of their license, they'd get off, and somebody else with another license would get on. So they had been real pilots in their day, but had suddenly become redundant, and you had that a lot on the river where somebody was really posted up on one section of river, and you hired him to navigate that section of river. But nobody could interfere with it. I mean, it was the federal law that, I don't care if you own the boat or not, you couldn't tell the pilot what he could and could not do. So Mark Twain was, he missed those days, bless his heart.
Well, you did mention it, with the advent of the steam engine and the locomotives. When did the split between, or not the split, but the tension, I suppose, between rail and barging?
That was probably gradual. For a long time, the railroads were designed to basically work with and augment the steamboat trade. And when they started building more tracks and more efficient steam engines for rail and started carrying more cargoes and taking more cargoes, you didn't have to follow the river valley to get your commodity from here to there or to travel from here to there. It was a straight line on a railroad track, and if that became reliable, as it gradually did, and that knocked the steamboat out of business. You took the train, not the boat. And it happened gradually, but the real tension probably started after 1850 and after. That's when, up on the Ohio River in particular, these people started there were enough rails, enough tracks that they started sending their produce instead of sending it south to New Orleans. They might send it to Chicago, you know, and which made sense. And that's when they started becoming rivals instead of partners. As I understand, as far as I know, as I understand it, it was gradual. It wasn't a single moment when it happened, but when it did happen, but you know, it didn't take long for it to happen because there was a lot of investment, you know, in the north, and because in manufacturing concerns, I mean, steel production started. You know, a lot of ores were moved, you know, to foundries and everything, and that, you know, that started. That was trade that did not go to steamboats because the rivers didn't go everywhere. You know, and that's a, you know, there's your, you know, the difference between uh eras. There is that, you know, it was wonderful that there were such rich, you know, riverine resources in the Ohio and Mississippi Valley, and it was. I think one of the great cotton producing regions was up around Shreveport on the Red River, you know, and Red River is not a very big river, but a lot of Red River cotton came down to New Orleans, and that was a big deal. Uh, but then, you know, it wasn't long. There was a rail line that came across the river, you know, and in 1930, you know, the rail made this compact with the people who built the Vicksburg Bridge, you know, that rail line, they could operate. They made a contract where they had the use of that for 1,000 years. Now, whether that old bridge will be still standing there, I don't know. But it you know, it crossed the river. They didn't have to, you know, break the train up and put it on cars and take all day to trip it across the river. Not at Vicksburg, they did. You know, and they didn't in Memphis either.
Well, how, I guess you kind of joined the industry possibly towards the end of a transitional period, but what do you know about the move from steam to diesel engines and maybe the first vessels you stepped on? What was that?
I don't know a lot about it, to tell you the truth. Never worked on a steamboat, you know. Uh, I've been on a boat that probably at one time was a steamboat, you know, and it was, oh man, there was enough room on there for 30 people probably at least, but you know, but uh, I don't know a lot about that. I've known people. I mean, I've known, like I say, I've known people who operated steamboats, you know, but most of the people, even the old timers I encountered early on, you know, had been on diesel boats. Old Captain D. O'Donnell, you know, he came along with those early diesel boats, and they didn't have a lot of power, but didn't have many barges either. But they would use some of these old steamboats, like the Sprague, you know, they would wait for one of those diesel boats to come along with rudders, you know, and wheels, because the rudders on you have monkey rudders behind the wheel on a steamboat, which weren't very effective. Any steering you did was forward of the wheel. So northbound steering, they were not very powerful. And there were some of these places where you had to mount a reef. And you come up to the into the crossing It's very swift coming off because it's shallow. Those crossings shallow up. You know, you may even have where you got more than one channel there. But to come out of this deep water and make that steer, one thing it's going to try to set you back up underneath that bar is what it'll try to do. But at the same time, it's hard. It's a hard shove, and you've got to keep it kind of up in the crossing, you know, so you don't get set down on the ball on the sandbar. And it's a hard push. It's hard. Sometimes it's hard to make that steer, and those steamboats just couldn't do it. And they'd wait for one of these diesel boats to come along and get them to tie their toe off and come help them make the steer, you know. And so that was cooperation and all that. But I don't, you know, I don't have any particular insight into what it was. I mean, there are some people around. Don Sanders, for example, he's around. I don't know whether Jim Davis, what kind of shape he's in. I hadn't heard from Jimbo in a long time, but he worked on one of the steamboats for a while with the Delta Queener. Most of the old guys that I knew that worked on steamboats are gone. You know, all of them, they're all gone. Been gone a long time. So I don't have any particular insights into what it was like and how it was different, you know.
Roger that, sir. It looks like you got me to about 90 minutes, and I think that's just enough. What do you say?
That's about all I've got to say about it.
Well, I do appreciate your time as always. Like I said, this should
Well, I enjoyed doing it. Thank you.
this should be released. I'm planning December 31st, I think,
Okay.
as the first entry for that new show. Once I get this thrown together, I'll put in an email to you and with all those individuals I was talking about.
Yeah.
I'll blast it out and I'll tell them to, you know, take a look at it. Any questions, anything to add, we can possibly set up some kind of roundtable with folks that have worked on the American Queen and things like that.
Yeah. Try to communicate. I think I know Don Sanders has got his own thing, and I'm not sure how old Don is, but if you'll tell him what you're going to do, that I've done this, and can get him to listen to this, he actually would know a lot about it. Because he knew all of those old guys, you know, that I knew, who worked on the Mississippi Queen and the Delta Queen, and you know, worked on it himself. He'd be a good one if you get him to do it. You know, tell him I'll send him an email to.
Yeah, I've tried a couple times. He was in the middle of releasing that book, and I think had a bit of a health scare. But
Oh yeah, I kind of got the impression that he did. Yeah.
yeah. But no, I'm trying. He's on my list. It's just not successful so
Okay.
far.
Okay, great. Well, I sure enjoy doing this.
Well, thank you very much, sir. We'll keep in touch.
All right, we will. Thank you.